Hello there and welcome to The Value of Everything. I've got here a special guest, Cameron Murray. He is an economist who specialises in the property market, environmental economics. He teaches at the University of Queensland, blogs at fresheconomicthinking.com and tweets at, and I think you're going to have to give me that
Cameron Murray.
Dr. Cameron Murray, there you go. So just to give the audience a little insight about you, could you explain what got you involved?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I guess I'm from Brisbane, Australia. I'm an economist now, and I guess I went from being a standard economist in the public sector to becoming a very outspoken critic of economics and I guess critic of many of the dodgy insider deals going on in politics after seeing firsthand a lot of what happens in the bureaucracy and what happens in the private sector, particularly in Brisbane. I've worked for property developers and I've worked for the regulator in a variety of ways, looking at regulation of water use, of rail prices, of what we call developer charges and so on. So I had a bit of a glimpse from both sides, and at some point I decided, look, I can either play along with this game and keep quiet and pretend that I'm doing something useful for society, or I can take a step back and have a really deep look and see if I can do something more productive and find out how we can do things better. In fact, when I was having this sort of existential crisis, I decided I'd become a medical doctor because that would be the way I could help people and make use of my life.
Yeah.
And I actually spent 6 months sort of sneakily studying at my job. That was, again, something I figured was a waste of time and something that involved a lot of going around in circles. So I found a lot of time to study, and I got accepted into medical school and thought I'd be a doctor. Having 2 young children at the time, I decided it was best to talk to my friends who were doctors and get some advice before I actually committed. And they said, that's a terrible idea with young children. And I was 30 years old at the time. And so I had a friend I'd met, Paul Frieders, who was a professor at the University of Queensland, and he'd been reading what I'd been blogging about not so much this dodgy insider deals, but just my general blogging on economic theory, on property markets, on how we can regulate things better. And he said, look, you can do good things in academia, and you can find the time to actually study these things properly and come out the other side with, some expertise that you can share. And so I'm out the other side now. I'm teaching subjects, and some of the research I did on what I call grey corruption or networks of favoritism, I've put into this book with Paul. This is what he considers it in some ways his parting gift to Australia. He's moved to the London School of Economics,
right.
And I sort of see it as my gift of my contribution to the public debate, having now spent the time doing the research, sorting out what's bogus, what works, and putting it out there and hopefully broadening the public debate, which is insanely narrow in Australia, about economic reforms and what's really possible as a society to do. So it's out there now, and it's getting some attention, and I really hope there is a political opportunity to get some change. I'll tell you just quickly. Last week, I was invited to be an expert witness at a Crime and Corruption Commission inquiry into relationships between councillors and property developers in Queensland. And so already people have seen some of this research and said, you've done the research now, tell us tell us about it. And so I got the chance to speak at that inquiry, explain that, in fact, your focus on developer donations is missing the whole point about how grey corruption works in Queensland. And if you think you finish this inquiry and ban developer donations that anything's going to change, you'd be wrong. How about you guys think about some real solutions, and here's some for you. So yeah, so I'm trying to now make a difference, I guess.
You're getting your hands dirty.
That's right.
I noticed that there was a Fairfax media announcer who was talking
Michael
about...
Pascoe.
Yeah, Michael Pascoe, and he was going through all these different issues with the property market rezoning. He mentioned your name, and I was like, oh, he actually had some solutions. And the one thing that always struck me is that everyone's talking about all these problems all the time, but nobody really says, here's a way we can get around this mess. So I had to seek you out, and I found out that you released a book which goes into a lot more detail. However, it is not anything too technical. It's a really nice read. So thank you for that, Cameron. So to move on to our actual interview itself. Now, a lot of people would say that what you're doing is you're trying to highlight problems in society, and there's problems with authority. They're in it for themselves and they're manipulating things, and we're just these people on the outside and we're very helpless. So the question that I pose to you first is, what really separates you from a conspiracy theorist?
I do like this question. I'm not sure if you've read the book yet. For the listeners, go to gameofmates.com and find out where to buy it. What separates me is I've done the research. I actually designed, for example, a computer game. I've had over 500 test subjects, university students, come in and play this game where they had the chance to form networks and favor each other, and they did this without even thinking. In fact, they felt good about it. And so what I've learned from my experiments, and obviously reading the results of others and the research of others, is that it's definitely 100% not a conspiracy. All I'm trying to say is that humans are wired to cooperate in networks, in groups, in friendship networks. Just look at Facebook, look at how we organize. We form little groups and we're loyal to them. We form clubs and societies. That's what we do, and it's usually beneficial. We help each other out in these ways. So it's not always bad that we cooperate. The problem comes when particular groups are cooperating in these ways, but they actually get to trade their gifts with each other and help each other out, not by giving each other things that they own, like giving your friends birthday presents, but when they get to give you gifts that are essentially stolen from the rest of society. So political decisions that give a gift to a friend that should have been sold are essentially stolen from the rest of society, who now have to pay the taxes because that, for example, piece of land was not sold at the market price, and given to the mate. And so I call these grey gifts. I guess the catchphrase is they're the currency of grey corruption. So when I have control of all these gifts that I can give that don't cost me anything personally, well, we're in a different world. And that's where we have to be really aware of when these groups form and the cost that they impose on others. When there isn't this external cost of gift giving, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I mean, this is how people organize and how companies, firms, churches, church groups, community groups organize together. It's a natural way for humans to behave. So I think from my perspective, I very much say it's not a grand conspiracy. It's the natural way humans behave at all times in history, in all societies. But what we should be thinking about is not, and when you start realizing it is a natural way to behave, and that the problem is not that people are cooperating and favoring their friends, the problem is that doing so costs others, it points you to different solutions to what you normally get.
Right.
So, for example, a lot of people say, oh, well, if we got rid of those bad people and voted in good people, that would make the difference. And I can tell you, I had 500 very honest young university students who had essentially no skin in the game, no animosity against other players. And what they did, they found other people in this game and they formed alliances. And they did so subconsciously and without even thinking about how much it cost the out group, the other students in the computer game. And they felt good about it at the end. So the trick is not that they're bad people. Anybody you put in these situations is going to act like that. And I think that's sort of one of the reality checks that a lot of anti-corruption campaigners have not really taken on board seriously. A lot of the campaigners buy into this conspiracy theory, or they have personal vendettas against other people, and they're missing the fact that no, anybody you vote in this situation, in this system, will succumb to the temptation, and they won't realize that it will be subconscious, because that's how everyone is cooperating around them. So that, that's why I have suggestions and solutions. For example, that article by Michael Pascoe. In that, he puts forward my solution to corruption in land rezoning.
Yep.
And so in land rezoning, the grey gift is the additional value of the land from drawing a politician or a bureaucrat drawing the line on a map and saying, within this area, you can build an additional 10 stories. So every landowner in that area gets their land value goes up. And that's a freebie, right? So this politician or bureaucrat's giving this gift to someone. It doesn't cost them anything, but we know it costs society, because they could have sold those additional property rights to develop at a higher density. How do we know that? Because countries and states and cities actually do that. So in the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra is in Australia, that's been going on for over 50 years, selling these additional property rights, and they raise hundreds of millions of dollars a year from selling the rights to developers. So they don't even have a land development industry. They only have home builders. There is no, because the land development industry is essentially a speculate on government rezoning industry. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But the catch being that they got to do this sort of upfront before the industry became entrenched. So it's a lot harder to change it now than it is to change it early on, where there's very little value at stake. And it's a lot different in Canberra, where there are many more bureaucrats and the public is much more informed about these procedures and administrative requirements. So it's a great big secret in the property development industry that we have this system in Canberra, in the ACT. Everyone I speak to kind of doesn't want to talk about it. It's if you are part of the club, it's a signal that if you start raising this idea, which is traditionally known as a betterment tax, if you start raising this idea in circles, you'll be shunned. I actually interviewed a lawyer who wrote some of the property law for Queensland a few governments ago, and I said, "Why didn't you put a betterment tax in? That's so logical." And he said to me, "If you even raise that word in these circles, you will be shunned. You'll be cast as an outsider, and no one will speak to you.
Right.
Nothing you say will be taken or considered seriously at all, ever." So we also talk about that in the book, about how these informal networks close ranks when their honeypot is threatened, when the free money that flows between them is threatened.
Yeah.
And that's also a natural thing to do. You see that in all organizations. They close ranks and protect themselves when there's a threat to their ongoing sort of profits.
I like it how you run the portrayal of this everyman Bruce, and the antagonist James is from his indirect actions that it really conflicts with Bruce's life.
Yeah.
And I remember just reading through it. Every time I'm seeing that the corruption happens, I read further and I'm like, oh no, is this really happening? And it just gets worse and worse as time goes on. And you actually almost feel awful when you want to put the book down for a bit, and then you have to soldier on through and you go, oh my gosh, this is happening as well.
Well, in some ways, yeah, that's the purpose of the book, is to confront people with how serious it is. But I guess the bits we left out, or that we subtly bring up at the end, is that even though all this is going on, and the book is obviously primarily about Australia, even though all this is happening, Australia's pretty good on a global stage. I mean, I guess I'd summarize it as in, a lot of the political favoritism in Australia is perfectly legal that would be illegal in other countries. So we're not so corrupt in terms of these official measures of corruption. We just entrench it. So, for example, sticking with property for a minute, you can imagine that getting your land fast-tracked through an approvals process by bribing someone should be illegal, but we just adopt a formal procedure called something along the lines of state significant projects or special project declarations. So we just formalize that process. If you can lobby hard enough and influence the right people, they have a formal mechanism to respond and offer you this freebie. So there's no corruption. They're using the rules that are in place, but the net economic effect is exactly the same.
There's a question of law, and on the other side, there's a question of like ethics or
That's right.
morality.
That's right.
I guess there's one other little kind of argument, and it's not a good argument, but it's an argument that I've heard before, is that
Yeah.
there's a problems with politics, and that's the fact that politicians aren't paid enough compared to the corporate world anyway. So isn't it kind of seen as a compensation?
Yeah, look, if we were in a world where the gifts that politicians received and that they gave were their own to give and not sort of society at large's property rights or rights to things or tax money, then it wouldn't really matter so much. I think this argument really buys into the idea that the corporate world, the pay for executives in the corporate world is actually has some kind of meaningful relationship to their performance or ability. And I actually think that is quite wrong, because we can write rules that would see corporate executive pay massively reduced as well. And
Right.
then it would be comparable. So I don't think the point is to pay politicians more and increase the social distance. So when you talk about relationship networks and mapping out who knows who, a measure of how far away you are, how many people it takes for you to know someone else, that's kind of a formal measure of social distance. So the wealthier they are compared to average, the less they can understand what the average person thinks, and the more they're going to relate to the corporate world, because they're traveling in the same circles. They can buy the yachts, hang out at the golf club, and so on. So I think it's actually important. So there's 2 points. One, you can't pay them too much, because you want to draw these people out of the pool of the sort of normal working population, not the sort of executive class. There's no magical skills about being in the executive class. We know it's mostly nepotism and cronyism and, being born in the right families. So you really want to draw them out of the pool of everyone else, and you don't want to pay them too much to essentially draw politicians from the class of people who are essentially most able to influence them and use those powers of grey gifts to get favours.
Okay. I'll give you another argument. So, what about throughout time and throughout history? If we look at ancient Greece, there's always been sophists, and these are paid trainers of how to. If you're a young man, you want to really ascend up the ladder of authority. You pay these sophists, and they'll train you. They'll get you network connections. You'll rise to the top, and you'll achieve this powerful position. So this historically is it's not like a thing of our times. This is something that's been going throughout time, and if anything, you could say that there's you got your average worker who's trying to be honest and works every day, but then there's the other game as well. The other game that's being played where everyone knows that you really got to try and work your way up this power ladder, and there's a game to be played anyway.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say about that? Like, life is a game in itself. People are trying, like, we live in a capitalist system. People are trying to
Yeah.
ascend, and the game's not fair. So why should we all try and be honest?
Yeah. So if you can't beat them, join them.
That's
Everyone's got
right.
to play. There's no opting out. In a way. Well, I mean, I think the problem is that is true. There is no opting out. There's always a game to be played. We know this because, as you've said, it's been the case for thousands of years. And I guess the modern version of what you've described are professional lobbyists who open those doors and get you the right meetings and elevate you through the ranks. So, in a way, the point I guess I try to make is that we can't stop this behavior. Everyone will want to join them. What we can do is set up institutions or rules in particular sectors that have highly valuable gifts to be given for free and take those away, so that even though people are playing it, the payoff is not so high. The winners don't take all. It's a much fairer system. So even if you become highly influential and get political power, you can't just rezone your mate and hand them $100 million worth of property rights, because you've taxed them away. You can hand them maybe a couple of $1 million at most. So you're taking away this massive attraction for playing the game, maybe more people won't even bother trying, and those who do are going to get a much smaller payoff. So, yeah, in a way, I guess that's the benefit of spending the time and doing the research and being this objective outsider without, my own, without being caught up in it myself, is I can see that there isn't a perfect world.
Yeah.
It's not just if everyone behaved correctly, we'd be fine. It's just let's take some pretty important steps to make the payoffs much, much smaller from doing this. And let's just set up the right institutions. So even if there are political favors, which we know are going to happen no matter what, but they're just not worth as much. And they're not sucking up resources, attracting hundreds and thousands of people into playing the game and wasting their time lobbying because, it's just not worth their while.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. So, well, I remember having like different visions of Australia when I was young, and I always thought that I think it even comes across in the accent. The accent is a very you haven't got the thing in the UK of like the well-to-do person, the working class, middle class. You've got a fairly standard egalitarian society, and that it comes out in the
Mm.
accent as well. But it seems like over time Australia's been losing that status. I know you was talking about it in the book. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So this happens to all societies. It's I think Australia had the benefit of A, being quite a young society, and B, being involved in large scale war while being a young society. And the people that study quantitative history and the rise and fall of civilizations, pretty much the main finding is when you fight wars, when you're highly cooperative internally. So we end up with all these great public institutions looking after the returned soldiers, giving them free land, having redirecting all this management of the production of the war effort into really cooperative and fair systems of domestic production. So we had the advantage of not being old and having these long hereditary dynasties of wealth control, and then fighting the first two wars of the 20th century,
Yep.
and then coming out of that being just a perfect storm of situation to have this egalitarian period of society. But of course, like the rest of the world, and maybe that's why some people think the book's a bit over the top, because they want to compare Australia to particular other third world countries, developing countries,
Yep.
corruption in China, wherever they want to go. The point is, we started at a low base, at a high base, and we're going backwards. Um, you know, the problem is once you start going backwards, it's hard to turn around. That's one of the things I found in my computer experiments. I would change the rules halfway through, and I would take the money away. And you know what? The favoritism just kept going, and it still cost everyone else.
Yeah.
Even though so the point is to stop it before it starts. And I guess that's another reason it's so important for me to shock people with this book now, is that it's too late once we've privatized all the public services, once we've accepted this, once all the organizations, the unions, and the power of the community groups is gone. It's too late. Or any win from that point is going to be small and insignificant. Let's try and have a few big wins before that happens. So it happens. It's happened in the US. They're a bit of much older sort of country now than Australia in relative terms to Europe, I guess, in
Yeah.
terms of new countries. And so now they have this dynastic inherited wealth going on there, and we are now seeing that here. And of course, the attraction of that is, well, the public never gets their hands on any of the mineral wealth. If you compare us to Norway, and how much of the mineral wealth they extract and get to distribute around society, ours is a pittance. And so, that's one of our main things. We've missed out on that. In property, we've missed out. And so now we have these dynasties of the well-landed, those who own large farms, large holdings of land in the city, that their families are going to be fine. And then we have now Bruce, our champion Aussie, our outsider in all of these games, the person who doesn't want to involve themselves, who's trying to earn their living from a wage. They're missing out if they try to buy a house. They don't get to inherit a house. They don't get a hand on the minerals resources. They got to now pay for their university education. They got to pay it back in debt. They're missing out in every single way there is to miss out. So I guess, yeah, Australia's come off a very high base, and the trick in all these things is it's hard to recover. Civilizations rise and fall, but they fall all the way to the ground.
Yeah.
So we got to sort of make the effort now. Yeah.
Before it turns. So, why has it turned into a game for these mates? And when I say game, you're using a particular word there, and I can see what you're doing there with the book. But to other people and in other people's minds, it's a crime. So, why is it perceived as this game?
Why do I use the term game to describe this behavior, or why
I guess
do...
there's two questions. I've loaded it twice there. That
Okay.
question. There's a game in the minds of these people. I guess you're trying to highlight to that. But why has it turned into a game? Why aren't people or these, I don't know, politicians or anybody in these positions of power, why are they perceiving it as a game and not perceiving it as I'm doing these bad actions? Because I think that could be
Yeah,
wrong.
okay.
They're almost convincing themselves that,
It's a good thing to do.
yeah,
Okay, so I'm quite certain that they don't see it as corruption. I'm quite certain that almost everybody, part of it, sees it as the way things are done, and that many of them will see it as the right way to do things. So let me just take you back to the more abstract and controlled computer game. I actually surveyed these students after when they played and asked them how they felt about it when they were forming these alliances with their mates informally and those who missed out.
yep,
And there was a really interesting result is that those who formed the alliance, they justified it as being the right way to behave in this situation, but they also concealed it and said, but I didn't do it like that.
right,
Not only that, they reported that they were happier. So there's this cognitive dissonance going on that, oh, if you make me think about it, yeah, it probably wasn't the right thing to do, but I felt good doing it, so therefore it must be justifiable. And I've actually had people come into the experiment who I've told them, look, the experiment's designed to seduce people into cooperating with their mates at a cost to everyone else. Because it feels good to do it while you're there, it's pro-social in a way.
yeah.
It's helping somebody. I mean, that's the most sociable thing in the world. How can you feel bad about that? They end up justifying that helping my mates, if it feels good to me, must be the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Imagine if someone else was in power, their mates wouldn't be as good as my mates. They would steal so much more from the public. Therefore, what I'm doing must be the best thing. So I don't think it's a sinister conspiracy. It's just the seduction of the situation with that money on the line, cooperating, getting these great outcomes as a team. You just get seduced into it.
They almost can say, yeah, I was acting with loyalty. I was being a good friend.
That's, well, of course, yeah. Or they can even say, I know this person, they're going to be the best contractor to build this government road because I trust them.
Yeah.
I can't get someone I don't know and trust to do a good job. In the private sector, that makes perfect sense. You want to build these relationships and employ people that you trust because it's efficient. But in the public sector, when it's not your money to give, you have to be a lot more careful. And that's why the book is really trying to refocus and say, look, this is a natural way people cooperate. It's really good when the private sector cooperates with their friends and forms their organizations. But when you're handing out free money from the public, then we've got to think of a different system to avoid you just favouring your mates.
So I know obviously you can go into a tremendous amount of detail on all of these points, but is there like a particular main category way of how the system is being manipulated?
Yeah, so I guess the book describes the 4 ingredients that you need to get a game of mates going.
Yeah.
And so the first ingredient is what I call the grey gift. So you need something of value that can be given with discretion to someone instead of somebody else that doesn't cost you anything. So that can be a political decision that forces people to save in superannuation and doesn't constrain the fees charged on superannuation. That's just a gift. That's just funneling money into the established superannuation funds that they're going to siphon off each year. It can be the rezoning gift. It can be the gift of mining. Oh, we're not going to increase your royalties. We're not going to charge you a super profits tax like in Norway. We're just going to let you approve your next mines for free. Whereas the discretion is, well, hang on, we could approve it, but charge you the market price of the minerals. So the first ingredient is that. And once you have that in place, all you need then is a group of mates who you can trade with. And one gives a grey gift, the other can directly or indirectly respond with a cushy appointment on the board, some other token job after politics. It can happen before or afterwards. So when people worry about political donations, or you're buying this favor, I'm like, no. They can pay afterwards as well on credit. They can appoint them to their board of directors, pay them a fortune for showing up once a month. That's the way they get their money into the politician's pocket.
Yeah.
And if you look in Queensland, almost every important politician has rotated into property developers. Former Premier Anna Bligh is now the chief of the banking lobby in Australia. Former Premier Campbell Newman works as an in-house lobbyist at Springfield Land Corporation, the largest property developer in southeast Queensland. So there are other ways to repay gifts directly or indirectly to people at the top of politics and in the bureaucracy themselves, because a lot of this takes place in the day-to-day dealings of the planning system and the regulatory system, APRA, the regulator of the banks, the planning offices of councils and state governments across the country, the departments of mining and so on that assess these approvals. The people within there are also susceptible to the game.
Yeah.
And they will get rewarded and rotated into the industry and back as well. So you've got a grey gift, you've got a group of people who you can repay and who can make decisions that favour you, and you can get money back to them directly or indirectly. The next trick is you need to be able to signal to coordinate with each other. You need to know who's going to join the game and cooperate and continue it, and who is going to not join. If you give them a favour, they're going to dob you in and sell you out. And so if we look at, for example, attendance at industry breakfasts, saying the right things in the media, living in the right suburbs, sending your kids to the right school, driving the right car, speaking the right language, supporting the right, maybe not so much supporting the right political party anymore, because it doesn't so much matter in Australia. Most of what's in the book are untouchable parts of the economy right now.
Yeah.
So you do all this sort of stuff to filter out and make sure they're good people. And you can think about the mafia, getting your facial tattoo is a signal of you're going to be loyal to the mafia. And in fact, I found in my research that this social network I mapped out to predict which landowners would get rezoned and which didn't. The characteristic of this network that predicted it is the same characteristic that another researcher found predicted which members of the US Italian mafia of the 1960s accumulated the most property wealth from being in the mafia. So it's a really natural social hierarchy, a social clustering that occurs. So you need a way to vouch for people, to see who's a good guy, see who can join the club, and lobbying and political donations are part of that process. So you can hire a lobbyist, that's like getting someone to vouch for you from the mafia, or you can donate, which is burning money, proving that you're willing to burn all this money because it's not going to change the election outcome typically, to be loyal to them in the future. Look, I've got the money to burn to prove that I'll be loyal to you if you give me favors. So that's the next ingredient. The final ingredient is your group needs to cover their tracks and create a plausible myth that the public can be content with, that says what's good for me and my mates happens to be good for society. So in property, it's, if you don't rezone land, no housing will get built. In banks, it's, if you regulate, it's going to add costs to this, or it's going to, it won't be secure if you add competitors to the banks. In mining, the miners will go somewhere else if you tax them a super profits tax. We know that's not true. And in fact, we know it doesn't even matter because the minerals are still there. You can mine them in the future. In fact, as a society, it might be better to mine them in the future when they're worth more than they are now. Okay, so we don't even know if it's optimal to tax them and make them leave and mine at a slower rate. Yet that's the plausible story that the insiders will also use to signal, so they will make sure they say that story. So, for example, when I talk to this lawyer and he says you can't say betterment tax, he's saying, well, if you aren't buying into the myths, you've signaled you're the outsider. You've signaled you can't join the game and be trusted, because you're not saying the right things. You're not signaling to them by perpetuating the myth. You're not wearing the right clothes. You're not saying the right things. You're not doing that.
Yeah.
So these, taken together, this is sort of a stripped down view of how you might see different components of what's going on and go, I know why that. For example, the new Chinese property developer has come in and donated $500,000. They've become the largest political donor in Australia.
Yeah.
Well, I know that because they're an outsider. They're trying to signal, they're trying to get in. They're going to probably hire lobbyists to vouch for them as well because they're not an insider yet. they're not getting the favours. They're the outsider. They're trying to get in. So you've got to see the donations for what they are. And once you sort of see it through this lens, and I guess that's one of the other things I want the book to do is to reframe things for people, to really have a better idea of how this works and see it in the terms of grey gifts, groups, signals, and myths, and go, aha, I know that person's saying that because they can't say anything else or they'll be kicked out of the game.
So you paint this picture of all of these components working well, they're all working in self-interest. Well, where does the public or where does the voter get a say in all of this?
Yeah, so the voter doesn't get a say. So I guess the sad reality is that democracy, if it could change anything, they wouldn't allow it. I mean, just take a honest look at what Donald Trump's achieved. Absolutely nothing, because there are these large subnational organizations, the vested interests, the whole industries, all their groups and their lobby groups that like the way things are. They're very hard to change. So the honest thing is that it's very rare to have the political opportunity to make changes. There really has to be a government that is really going to risk losing, that has to promise something that risks putting offside these mates for the benefit of them staying in power to give other favours in the future, right?
Yeah, very warped.
You got to pick these political timing. You've got to have good solutions being talked about at the right time so that when someone's desperate, so at the moment Malcolm Turnbull I think is getting desperate, he's announced he's going to go with these Gonski reforms to education. So they were on the table when Labor was in power 6 or 7 years ago
Yeah.
about education, and he's picked them up because the political opportunity is right. Okay, and it's going to upset a lot of people because it takes money from private schools, it takes money from the kind of the pipeline of new insiders. But if the pressure's on, he's got to do something. Okay, so when there's that electoral timing, that political pressure, then you can get some change. And it's not, you're not going to get a lot of change all at once. If we look at when the Labor Party in Australia was elected before the financial crisis, Kevin 07, he came out of the blocks and he wanted to tax mining and change superannuation and change education. He wanted to shake it up, and that was great. But he picked too many fights too quickly and was crushed by the rebellion of the mining companies after he tried to tax them. You've really got to get the political timing right to get this through and know when you can piss off a whole industry and take back the wealth for the public,
Yeah.
and when you can't get away with it.
All right. So I remember when I was working in London and I used to look at the newspaper and I was like, whoa, the property's going crazy over here. It's going up and everyone's like, the media's pumping it. But then I moved over here and I went, oh my God, this property game is on a whole different level. Um, it's a strange phenomenon until you're over here and you see things and you see auctions, you see all these renters trying to rent one house. You see the media, everything like that. It's just a crazy parade of all these weird special interests. So could you give us like a picture of what's going on with the property game and then go into a little bit more detail on what you've noticed on the rezoning?
Sure. So in Australia, the unfortunate situation in terms of property speculation and the price boom, the unfortunate situation is we have four major banks that seem to be unable to do anything except lend money for housing. They seem not to want to lend money for anything else. We also have a situation in 2001, I think it was, we created this capital gains tax discount, which means that the capital gains you get from the property, not just the property that you live in, but from any actual capital gains in the share markets or anywhere else, is taxed at a 50% discount. You actually only pay tax on half of it. So that meant it just attracted everyone in because, of course, how do you want to make your money? From wages and get taxed, from running your business and from the income, or from the capital gains and pay half the tax? So everyone wants the capital gains. So everyone has to be in the market to get them. And so the banks can only, they're very good at lending for housing. Everyone pours in, the price goes up. It's a self-reinforcing cycle, and we end up where we are now. And in the process, we're forgoing the capital gains tax itself, which is some phenomenally high over $20 billion a year in free capital gains because of this discount on the tax that John Howard introduced that no one seems to be able to reverse. Now that it's there, it's hard to go backwards. And as I said earlier, so we're giving away the capital gains for free.
Yeah.
And this is not a small amount of money. So last year, the average property in New South Wales went up in value more than the average wage earner earned in the whole year. So the average house made more money from doing nothing, not even the value of the rental income, just it went up in price more than what the average wage earner could do. And the perverse outcome of that is that the wage earner pays tax at the standard rate on personal income. The speculator who then cashes in on that, it's $75,000 or something it was per house and per wage earner. The speculator who cashes in pays half the tax of the wage earner.
Yeah.
So it's just phenomenally bad setup.
Yeah, I always like using an analogy of like you're almost trading mines, but they're not even operational mines yet. So I'm selling you this mine, another person bids me up for another mine on top of it. But these are almost non-operational, and they haven't extracted anything yet. So there's no profit that's going from it. It's just the fact that people are buying over each other for these different mines, but you're no yield is crazy.
It's insane, and the reality is it's going to turn around. Sydney property prices have gone up 75% in 5 years. Incomes have gone up about 5%. So something's going to turn around. It's going to happen. The problem, of course, is that the government, no one wants to be in government when the crash comes.
Yeah.
So they will throw Bruce's money, the public's money, at the interest to keep the property markets up. They will have more first homeowners grants, more first home saver accounts, more freebies to developers to make sure they don't suffer when the prices go down. Yeah, it's a bit sad, but that's the reality. And I don't think, it's not probably the worst thing in the world to try and stabilize the price on the way back down by throwing some money at people. But you don't want to throw money at the people who've just been speculating. Perhaps maybe at the people who can get in at the lower price.
So when you speak to a politician, what the general thing they say is, well, it's a supply issue. What we need to do is we need to build more houses. That's always the answer. What's wrong with that response?
Well, that's just one of the myths that suit the property industry. Because what sort of property developer would you be if you built so many houses the price went down? You've just subdivided.
Yeah.
We've got property developers up here. I think there's about 60 or 70,000 house lots they have. Of course, if you own 60,000 house lots, you're not going to build so much that the price goes down. So you drip feed it out at a rate that maximizes the present value of all your future incomes from selling these things. So in fact, the slower you go, often the better. If the price is rising fast, you don't want to sell your land or your new property. You want to sell it next week or next year when it's worth more, because it's better for you to make money being the speculator than being the developer and actually producing housing.
Yeah.
We know this is true because I know quite a few people in the development industry, and when the state government in Queensland built a new commercial building in the city, quite a large one, it flooded the market. It flooded the rental market in the city as all the departments moved out of the private buildings. And the development lobby says you can't do that. The private market would never have built that much new commercial space all at once and depressed the market.
Yeah.
And I said, well, okay, that's great. So you're saying that you guys build at a rate that keeps the price as high as you can. You've just proven to me that rezoning is a waste of everyone's time. The other thing is that if it was true that you had to rezone land to get houses built, well, you could rezone them and say, if you don't build what you've promised within the next 2 years, you can pay us a fine. You can take away that perpetual option they have to not build houses and say, look, you've promised you're going to subdivide because there's a housing shortage and build whatever, 1,000 or 2,000 houses. Well, bloody well do it. Or we'll take the land back, or we'll take the rights back, or we'll fine you. And no one ever does that, right?
Yeah.
Because we know, I've actually seen developers say in their planning applications, we need 30,000 new houses in this area in the next 10 years. And if we don't do it, there'll be a housing shortage and prices will go up. In the documents they then take to their investors, they go, this 30,000 lots that we're going to get is going to last us at least 30 years of 30 years of development.
Yeah.
So they've promised the government they're going to build them all at once, and they've promised their investors, don't you worry, we're not going to give it away too cheap. We're going to hold on to it.
And at the same time, it's almost very sophisticated because you've got pulleys which are happening from immigration as well. So you've got quite a large population which is continuously coming into Sydney. So you've got to augment it in a certain way with population, the amount of wealth that they have, and well, not necessarily the amount of wealth they have because it's really controlled by what the banks want to lend them.
Yeah.
But then there's loads of little nuances to keep the game running, and it's crazy how it's all still spinning.
That's right. Speaking of population, I don't think anyone in Australia voted to have the world's highest immigration rate in the developed country,
Yeah.
in the developed world, and yet that's what we got. And do you know why we got it? Because it works really well for land developers and banks. Banks make about $2,000 profit per household in Australia, and if they're not expanding overseas, how do they make more money? Well, they can put their interest rates up, or they can lobby for higher population growth. And every new household, that's $2,000 a year to share between the major banks. For land developers, it's obviously a freebie. In terms of its effect on property prices, it really depends on how wealthy the new immigrants are. Obviously, if they're not that wealthy, they're not going to come in and be bidding up for new housing.
Yeah.
But if you have an immigration system that's targeted at the super wealthy, for example, if you fast track immigration, if you spend over a particular amount of money on property, which we do have, administrative requirements like that, then you're going to attract not only the people, but their money, the rich people who are going to have to bid up property to stay in the country. We also have pretty relaxed, or what the Transparency International said, sort of terrible laws about keeping track of money laundering. So a lot of money that just people want to get out of Asia and buy safe foreign assets is, of course, chasing Australia and Canadian property as well at the moment. But I think that will run its course, just like the Japanese speculation in Australian property in the 80s ran its course. But of course, there are plenty of locals in the meantime that are raising their families, trying to save up, and never going to get into home ownership while they wait it out.
Yeah. And there's a funny thing as well with this entire system because you can say, okay, well, there's these people in authority, they're pulling all the levers. But there is a symbiotic relationship which is still going on with the public. Even Scott Morrison said, a lot of these investors are mamas and papas, not the band, but the people in your family. So you got shareholders. Shareholders can be the public as well. And the shareholders, it's this big cycle of all this interconnectivity. But then at the same time, there's major disconnects of responsibility. So it's a weird old picture, but why is these happening?
So, to be honest, a lot of it is just purely the outcome of small dispersed groups within the social network doing what's good for their friends. And as those small little movements accumulate, it appears at system-wide level that there's been some kind of coordination to get this elite group, everything favoring them and against everybody else. But in reality, it's just a natural result of responding to your mates. Oh, the banks are lobbying for a big Australia. Oh, that makes sense. I can find someone who agrees with them. They network and coordinate with think tanks that agree, and then you end up with this cluster of people pushing for that. And then coincidentally, it also benefits some of the other groups, and they buy in. So it's a very natural outcome. It's not a conspiracy. It's sort of just how it works. The fact that the public still buys into it, I mean, you could retrospectively say, oh, the compulsory superannuation system is a brilliant way to get everyone to believe that their future depends on the share market, all the public. But of course, the reality is that most of the public doesn't have anything in the superannuation. My prediction is that the superannuation scheme in its current form will collapse as all the baby boomers withdraw all their money and get on the sell side of all the asset markets they're in. Their remaining balances will fall because the capital value will depress, because instead of hundreds of billions of net additions to these markets in money sort of flowing in from saving, there'll be net dissaving from the system as a whole.
Yeah.
So all the markets that they've saved in will be depressed. So for me, anybody, say, under 35 should assume that they're never going to see their superannuation.
And if you're going to try and get your money out and self-manage it, it'll just cost you too much.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing is it's actually as a side note, one of my frustrations is how much attention and the media buys into this a lot, and I don't. I mean, I understand why because they're raised and taught at universities, and they go to the breakfasts and the functions with these people. But the fact that the share market gets reported in the news like it's some important thing for anybody in society, apart from the top few percent of people who own most of the share market is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
The fact that we judge the performance of the economy on how much rich people's capital gains went up on property prices and on share markets is absolutely ridiculous. Everybody who makes their money from wages, why don't they get on the headlines each night? Because we know a hell of a lot more people make their money from wages. And we can say regional wages in Queensland today went down. And we can say that every day for 10 years, and maybe we'll get the message.
Yeah.
But instead, we're focused on this.
There's almost some kind of social conditioning that goes on, I think, where you look at the news
Yeah.
and it goes, oh, yeah, the Australian economy has increased its GDP by this percentage, but what does it really mean to me?
Yeah.
And
That's right.
and all these, even if you dig into these percentages, these some of these percentages, like your consumer price index, that's the actual thing that should be saving the property market when that inflation of the house prices is kicking in into overdrive. That's the warning sign. It should be in the CPI, but the houses are not included in there. It's only like rental yield. Then the RBA should be stepping in there and raising interest rates and stopping the irrational exuberance. But even those percentages are so manipulated to a point that it happens on every single level. It's happening in our statistics, it's happening with deals, it's happening with licensing. There's no end to it.
The story behind that is that the RBA, well, inflation targeting became the buzz thing to do in the early 1990s. And the question, of course, which inflation? There are many inflations in the economy. There's the GDP deflator, and there's the consumer price index, and there's the producer price index, and there's the export price index. And
Yeah.
there are many price indexes. And they decided that they, for some reason, didn't want the GDP deflator. They wanted a consumer price index. And that they also didn't want to include investment in consumer prices. So they said, well, mortgages, they're sort of an investment because you can then go and sell the land that you're buying, the land component of your property at a higher price in the future. That part is an investment.
Yeah.
We don't count shares in the consumer price index, but your land is kind of like that. Let's take that out of the CPI. Let's construct this index in a different way. And so the RBA suggested that that was the right thing to do for inflation targeting, was to get that out of the CPI. And so we had that change in, I believe it was 1997. We changed the method and got rid of housing from the price index. And what happened after that? We had a massive boom starting in 1999 and 2000 in Australia that never showed up in the price index, but would have showed its face in the former method of calculating the CPI. So we sort of missed it, and we missed that it was important, and we missed that it was a cost to people.
Yeah.
Not so much people who had already bought houses, but it's a cost to the next generation who are having to get into the market.
Yeah. It's a really sad state of affairs. If you think about the amount of people that have got their lives on hold because they can't afford, just like they can't afford even half of what their parents could have afforded before them. It is a real sorry state of affairs. And is there any politician that has really, I mean, they say, oh, we're going to sort out negative gearing, but nobody's really shouting it out. And you'd win so many political points for even mentioning half of this stuff and really going against it. But it's so quiet.
You would think so. So there's a couple of things. One, we're all aspirational millionaires. So, don't tax us when we become millionaires, which is, very much more of a US thing. But I think Australians all think that one day they'll buy property and they'll be rich automatically. But the other thing is that we still a lot of people own houses. A lot of people own houses they bought before they became expensive, and they like them being high because they can now give them to their kids or sell them and fund their retirement. I guess we have reached the point, I would say, in the last 12 months where even these people that were sort of happy that they'd made lots of money for nothing in property are now like, oh, geez, but if I've got 3 kids, I can give my house to them, but they have to split it by 3, and the rest of their house that they have to buy is still quite expensive.
Yeah.
So only now has it really gotten to that point. But, the reality is no one can win government by promising to decrease house prices by 50%.
Yeah.
It's just never going to happen. And no one's going to do that because they also don't know what to do to keep the economy going in that situation, knowing that there will be a huge collapse in new lending and new construction for a few years. No one knows what else to spend the money on. We can't even build the NBN and get on with it. Everybody, pretty much, it's a unanimously supported public investment in future kind of infrastructure for the country.
Yeah.
And yet the politicians cannot agree just to get on with it and do it. And in terms of the cost, it's something like $40 billion. They want to spend hundreds and hundreds of billions on joint strike fighters, and everyone says, oh, yeah, build them. Not that anyone's going to get anywhere near them. They may never even see combat. And yet this infrastructure that every single household in the country is going to benefit from for half a century, we can't get it off the ground.
Doesn't see the light of day. So, one thing I do like about your book is that it's not just one guy just blabbling on about the gripes in society. You actually apportion it, you account it, you actually put in the costs to things, and you cite all of the source material that you're getting from as well. And this is where I think there's a massive divergence from just a conspiracy theorist and somebody like you. Once you start throwing numbers at people, it really starts to bamboozle them after a while. But is there a way for you to give people just an idea of what this kind of cost is to society?
Yeah. So the trick is when we say cost, we have to compare it to something, right? So what we've done in the book is compare Australia to the world's best in all the different sectors. If we had the best regulation in mining, in superannuation, in banking, and in property, in taxis, in competition policy, for education, and you name it.
Yeah.
So if we were the world's best at everything, which no one is, what is the difference between the society we have and this kind of economic benchmark where we should be aiming towards and where we were much closer towards 40 years ago? The rough scenario is that if you're a wage earner, you don't own any assets and you earn a wage and you're on the outside of every game, so you didn't get into the pharmacy game and be a pharmacist, you didn't inherit money, you're paying for your university, you're paying for your mortgage an extra amount, you're not going to get rezoned, you're paying extra for your taxis. If you're on the outside of everything, your household income could be double. So it's half of what it could be. So because of all the costs in this game, because we're so far from economic perfection, we're so far from the frontier of what we know is possible because countries do it in different sectors, you could be twice as much income, twice as well off. Now, of course, in the aggregate data, it's very hard to see this because people play the game in their sector. So you might be a pharmacist and be making an abnormally high income, but then have to go and borrow money from the bank and pay a high price for your house and pay extra, 0.7% on your mortgage for 25 years, and then also miss out on the transport benefits that you get from public investment that have gone to the public-private partnership, who's essentially owned by a mate of a politician. Not everyone misses out on everything, but if you do, you're half as much income as you could have been. But the net effect is there's this group who's on the outside of everything, and then there's intermediate groups who are in one or part of the game, and so they get a little bit, but then they lose a little bit elsewhere. And then there's people right up the other end of the spectrum that win at every turn. So in Australia, it's something like, in a ballpark figure from this, it's say 10 to 15% of GDP is being pushed up the income distribution every year because of just this.
Yeah, and I always see it as well as that it's malinvestment as well. It's going into certain pockets when it could be spread a bit more evenly in society. We don't know what kind of society we would have had if there was less corruption in it. We potentially, like Australia, could be augmented in a way that we might have more entertainment, we might have more restaurants, we might have all these different things and services to the public good that we do not have right now. And it's like even just trying to put a cost in it, it's really an awkward thing. But when you actually think beyond the cost and think, oh my gosh, this is having repercussions on our lives, our interactions, the way we are, even politics. It channels our way thinking to think, okay, well, the system's corrupt, makes us disconnected even further from politics. We feel like our vote's got no leeway. It makes no change in society, so it draws us away, disconnects us, as well as it wilts the flower of our own happiness.
Yep, definitely. And I guess one of the outcomes of this is the frustration of the outsiders. That group who is missing out at every turn, who's not playing any of the games, their last resort is Donald Trump or Brexit or Pauline Hanson or Le Pen or someone who's pro-nationalist who says, I actually care about people who live here, not just this small group of well-connected people. And the unfortunate reality is that a lot of this frustration gets diverted and funneled by these interests, as in, oh no, it's not your politicians to blame, it's the immigrants or the Muslims or something.
Yeah.
It's not an economic issue that your politicians are screwing you over and lying to you. No, that's not the issue. It's that these Muslims came and they wear headscarves, or they can't speak English yet, or whatever the case is. So that's just another ploy and another distraction. I'm not saying it's an orchestrated one, but at certain levels it will be, for sure.
Going to war is the greatest distraction of the politician.
Well, there's another one for you. The unfortunate thing is that going to war it actually ends up being a losing proposition for the winners as well, because after the war, everyone who's participated will realize that they can organize and have a lot more control of society. When you've been in the military, you know how to organize, got a lot of trust amongst your networks. You guys can rally in the street and get things the way you want them done. It's very hard for politicians to say, oh, no, we can't give war veterans free healthcare because that would be inefficient.
Yeah.
They would just milk the system. So in the US, for example, the war veterans get free healthcare. No one else does. It's efficient for them, but not efficient for society. That's one of the distractions, and it's quite frustrating. And I guess one of my personal gripes is that people see immigration as the choice of the immigrant. You've come here to ruin our society, and not people following the rules set in place by the people we elected of how people get to migrate.
Yeah.
If you had immigrated to the US and followed all their rules and jumped through all their hoops and got there, and everyone just hated you for following their rules that their policymakers wrote, you'd be like, but I just followed your rules, guys. This is how you guys wrote the rules.
Imagine if they said, one of the political parties says, look, we need to look at this population situation because the infrastructure is not being built, the roads, the traffic, the hospitals, all these things. That's real valid arguments that could be made. But do you hear that? Nah, never even mentioned at all. It's hushed out of society. It's a weird situation there. Now, sorry.
That's right. There is one political party in Australia called Sustainable Australia, and that's their major platform, is that, you know what? Everything is a little bit easier with lower population growth. Protecting the environment, that's a lot easier.
Yeah.
Improving our infrastructure, that's a lot easier too. Integrating the immigrants when there's a lower number coming each year. Do you know what? That's easier as well. And they call it the everything issue. They're in the background there, but what's interesting is that the Greens had a population policy until Pauline Hanson first became famous in the 90s, and they dropped it because it was too difficult to talk about.
Yeah.
Now that it had become a religious and racial issue rather than an environmental, sort of social and economic, a broader issue about not having to build more dams and just to duplicate the water supply, and not, replace rural land and forests with houses just to house these extra people.
Yeah.
And I think most Australians value the quality of life that having a lower population gives.
Yeah.
That's what makes it attractive. That's what people like. So we never voted for the world's fastest population growth rate. In some ways, I think it was a sneaky global financial crisis policy to hopefully just attract a few extra people all of a sudden and get some spending. But, since that time, the last 10 years, been really off the charts. So I think there will be some traction for Sustainable Australia or another party that suggests, you know what, this is not about your religion or your nationality or where you're from. It's about having a stable population so we can stop duplicating things and get on with improving things. So yeah, let's see what happens. But it's obviously a difficult, thinking about the media environment right now. It's a difficult conversation to have.
Yeah. Well, one of the things with governments is that They are issuing bonds, and the worst thing you can do is if you're issuing so much debt to all these foreign markets and investors, is that you've got a GDP that's declined and you cannot afford to, well, you might get yourself into a situation where you can always pay, but basically it gets to a situation where you're increasing the money supply so much that you're impoverishing the people. But it's the old trick. If you increase the population, you increase the GDP, then that gives you more viability to issue more bonds, and you can keep the gravy train going along for all the people and all your vested interests at the top.
That's true.
It's a funny thing where you talk about population, and like even if you hear from governments as well, deflation is the worst thing that could ever happen. Now you think to yourself, well, if I've got a job, I'm still earning money, and prices are going down, they're deflating.
Yeah.
What's wrong here?
Yeah, that's a question I posed to my macroeconomics class when we start talking about, well, it's actually not a problem in the standard neoclassical economic model because there's no money. It's just goods are getting cheaper compared to wages. But once you have all these outstanding balances of debts and obligations between people, then it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. But your point there about having this extra growth to give them a buffer, I think in the book I also mentioned that that's why economic growth in general is such an important objective. If you're a vested interest trying to cream off as much of a share of that economic growth as you can, because if there's no growth to increase your wealth and power, you have to steal from someone else. And when their incomes are going backwards, they're going to notice a lot more than when they're just growing slower than yours. So the growth is really important if you're in the job of creaming off most of that growth for yourself.
Yeah. So there is a crisis of democracy because a government is there to protect and redistribute wealth as fairly and as just as possible by a majority rule. If we have these oligarchs that make these rules for distribution, like, why are the majority participating and going, this is all right? Is it just that we haven't awoken yet, or is it just a case?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think there's just we like stability, and it really has to get quite bad before we take action and organize. And I think Donald Trump, Brexit, all that stuff is now the democratic pressure on countries to do something. And there's a great writer who's a former banker who's traveling around the US and interviewing people. His name is Chris Arnard. And he said, you know what? All these Midwest folks I've interviewed and met, for Donald Trump to drop a bomb on Washington.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what he does as long as he shakes it up and creates the space for change.
Yeah.
They don't care that he's crazy.
No.
Maybe it takes a crazy person. Look, I think Australia's just only a few years behind. I think Hanson's going to be a surprise winner the next federal election, possibly the next Queensland state election. Even though she's attracting absolute crazy people, where else do you go if you want the system shaken up? Every other politician standing around with their hands in their pockets saying, oh, I promised to give you a different coloured, flag or a new, some bogus distraction. Bill Shorten ruled out today having the Buffett rule on tax for the super wealthy. He's like, no, I'll give you just a fair tax system. I'll give you some generic, unspecified thing that I think is fair that I will promise but not really tell you. I'm not going to promise to do this rule because I'm 100% certain this rule is going to steal a lot of money from people I need to keep happy. So you get a lot of these wishy-washy politicians with their hands in their pockets, not really promising anything. Pauline Hanson's there. She's absolutely nuts. She seems to care. She's talking to people. People can relate to her, and she's going to get the votes, even if she has no idea what to do, what's going to be effective. And I think that's the same as Trump. So, I may end up having to have a tilt at politics just to put another option out there.
Yeah. There's these politicians that are very good of understanding emotion and feeding off the emotion and replaying that emotion. They might not have this great idea or this way to change society, but they know how to sense the mood, and they play that into their hands so well. They're the dangerous type of politicians, and if they gain too much power and they don't know what to do with this power, then we're going down even further a slippery slope, and we'll find people like you and me sent to prison.
I think, unfortunately, a lot of the people who are frustrated about it can't see it systematically and will just get sucked in and think they're doing the right thing once they're in power. They'll be easily manipulated
Yeah.
because they'll be an outsider. They'll be everything will go wrong for them. And then once they get in and start doing things that keep the mates happy, they'll realize, oh, I'm an insider. I must be doing the right thing now. Maybe I'll just keep doing this. I think they'll be too easily bamboozled. The people who you want are very sharp, understand things systematically, want to get in, do their time, get a few important changes done, and get out of there.
Yeah.
I actually think, for example, we could have a roster system for politics instead of voting, just like a jury, just lottery people into it, and you can do a few years and see how you go. I think the independents that got in at the Senate election, for example, Ricky Muir from the Motoring Enthusiast Party was probably the best senator we had for years. Um, because he didn't have
Connections.
anyone to keep happy, right? He could just sit there and go, oh, there's a renewable energy bill. I like the sound of that. Oh, there's this bill. That looks crap. And I'm like, that's what we should be having. People who represent us have the time, have the support to be able to make good judgments about things.
Yeah. In politics, there's like this triangle of power. You've got the people, you've got the educated ones, the people or the politicians, and then you've got the prime minister. And they say, like historically, according to the Greeks, that that's the best way the triangle could work. And you try not to give too much power to one of those points. So you don't want too much power to the prime minister or the
Mm-hmm.
dictator. You don't want too much power to the people, or that you've got mob rule, and then you don't want too much power to these technocrats or whoever they are, or the
Yeah.
politicians, or they'll just feed it for themselves. Now, it seems like we're on that last point that I just mentioned of the triangle, and it's a case of just trying to get us imbalanced on it.
Yeah, I totally agree, and where we think it's important in the courts, for example, and in law, we separate powers. We could do that in lots of areas like planning and regulation, but we don't. We see it as a different sort of thing. It's just an administrative requirement. We could certainly separate those powers. If you have a look, for example, at international football matches, you separate that. You get independent match referees from a country who's not playing that game. We get separate of powers for that point in time, and many of the solutions I propose involve that sort of principle, getting that independence in decision making. For example, the jury system. When we do change the town planning scheme, we can have somebody propose it, but we can have someone else decide which of the proposals is good. And we can have an international panel of planning experts who come in and they take the plan from the property council, from the community groups, from different government departments, and they can say, oh, yeah, I see what's needed here. That looks terrible. That looks good. Here's the plan.
Yeah.
And then they get flown home, and then there's another lottery next time, and our experts go to their country and they get to make those decisions. So we get that separation of power. And the problem, of course, is it's very hard to do that within a small region. In Queensland, you couldn't rotate planning experts in to make these decisions because they work for the industry that they're going to make the decision about.
Yeah.
So you've got to get that scale right. You know, people, if you're a mate of the criminal, you can't be on his jury at the trial. But what we've overlooked is that this is the subtle way in which these favours get given, is that the planners rotate in and out of lobbying for property developers one day, working for the council, evaluating their proposals the next day. So it's a good principle.
Yeah. Some people might come back to you and say, well, we've got a regulation system in place. But then on the other hand, you say, well, the taxpayers are paying the regulators, however, the regulators are susceptible. So this whole regulation game in society, what becomes the point of it if it's, like if you think about even the independent regulators, the Moody's, Standards and Poor's, pricing all the subprime mortgages in America as the greatest debt you can buy, it all is susceptible in this weird chain. So what's your view on regulation?
Yeah, so if it's going to be effective, you need to separate the interests quite clearly. You need to stop staff rotating both sides of the fence. I guess it's like a society. If you set it up well at the beginning, it will last a long time because the system will be hard to game. or the benefits from gaming it won't be very much.
Yeah.
But if you set it up poorly, then immediately it's going to begin disintegrating quickly and it'll be of little use. So, there are institutions like the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is set up and had very simple objectives, very simple policy tools. And, 30 years later, it's still going strong with its inflation targeting. I mean, the bank itself is over 60 years old. And people would say, well, I'm pretty sure that the bank is not acting on the whims of the private banks. So that was not too bad. And if you look at the APRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority, it doesn't have this public face and this accountability and this separation. At APRA, the staff rotate in and out of banks all the time. At the RBA, they don't so much. Okay, so you can see that there's a difference between one agency getting trapped into this and one not getting trapped into it. There's always going to be the case of who watches the watchers, who the regulators, who looks after them. And I guess that comes back to having those electoral windows where people do see things go wrong and will vote on those issues and get that change. So there's this feedback in the system. It's not easy to get, but it's possible. But we should really be looking to effective regulatory systems that work and essentially just copying them straight up. Any new industry, if the NBN actually did get through, maybe it was a good opportunity to set up a new telecommunications regulator.
Yeah.
And we would adopt some practices from look around the world, see what works, create a new organization, get a few foreign experts in there so that they really can just be objective and make sure there's no rotation into the industry, and then we can look after that asset, make sure there's a lot of competition in the retail market.
Yeah.
There are a few tricks to it because, and some of the tricks, people also get sucked into thinking that, for example, transparency, that's the trick. If everyone knew what was going on, that would be better. But in fact, sometimes that's not effective if you actually look at types of regulatory systems that work. For example, if you have a committee in the public sector deciding on the winner of a large construction tender, you might want to make that committee private, not public, so that no one knows who to lobby. And people can make decisions objectively without feeling that social obligation because no one knows that they didn't do their mate a favour.
Yeah.
So they're allowed to because it's private, even if there are relationships. So there may be cases where, you know what, we separate the powers and then we just don't tell who's deciding about what. And the trick is to start those systems and get them set up so that people trust them and then go, yeah, it's a really good system. Let's stick with it.
Yeah. So, do you have any particular view of how much power the government and an official should have?
I think ultimately the amount of power the government has is a lot less than people think it has. There are limits to what governments can do. Donald Trump has done absolutely nothing. When Kevin Rudd tried to make a lot of change, he got the boot. And so the government itself is quite limited and people fail to realise that. But at any point in time, little changes, one way or the other, have to be made at all sorts of levels, at council, state and federal level all the time. And someone's got to do it. The point being, well, when they do make changes, well, we know this game's going to be played because it's human nature. What we should really do is make sure that the changes aren't worth a lot to private interests.
Yeah.
So when we make councils dispose of land with public auctions or tenders to the highest bidder, we don't just let them sell it to their mates. So someone's got to make the decision to dispose of the land or buy land for the council, but we can make sure they do it in a way that limits not so much their power to get on with things and change things, but their power to give a lot of private value when they're doing that. And so that's sort of my rule of thumb. Someone's got to make the decision. Governments aren't as powerful as you think. They're making very small incremental changes at each point in time.
Yeah.
But what we should do is make sure when they do it, there's not a huge private giveaway. So they're free to choose on the technical merit of whether you should build this or that, or whether you should build a road here or there. Well, if no one's got an interest in owning the road and making lots of profit from it, we'll just do the one that's the most efficient for the network. What do the traffic engineers say? Oh, that's good. Where should we build this bridge? Well, what does the rail guy say? We'll build that one. We don't have to worry about those interests.
Yeah.
We'll just put it out to tender. Which construction company can build this? Oh, the one that lowest price. Great. Done. Simple.
Another thing that I just find it would just be very enlightening for you to say here is that What are the canaries in the coal mine when these corruptions get out of control, and when do we know it's going to get the big problems are going to happen? I always think about like the Bernie Madoff situation when the markets get wiped out, people lose their asset portfolios, then you're going to see all the shit that's happening in society, and people really get exposed at that point. But what's the initial stages, and then what are we going to see at the major stages of all of this corruption that's happening?
I think we're seeing that now with the political dislocation and everybody looking outside of the establishment politically. So this feedback loop through the electoral system, through the democratic system, is slow to get going. And of course, someone's got to rise up and offer the alternative as well once there's that frustration in the community. So I think this feedback is already starting now, and I think you can see it coming. And so perhaps a lot of politicians in power right now are doing is making sure they give out favors while they've got the chance.
Yeah.
Before any radical changes come, and before they lose the opportunity because the parliament is just too chaotic to get anything done. All these minor changes that give gifts here and there, they've got to get them done now where they can. So they've sort of put aside the public good. It's a race now to get those before the public gets their act together to change.
Whenever the public and private sector deals, it always seems to be some shady thing going on. Like, how do we put firewalls in between these entities? Because essentially the government doesn't really produce anything. They don't really create anything. They always have to get some kind of private investor in, and it seems to me that this is where a lot of the problems happen. So, do you have any ideas of how this conflicts of interest can be averted?
Yeah, there's a couple of ideas. Well, I mean, firstly, governments do things. I mean, everything that we've privatized in the last 30 years was generated from public organizations, banks, roads, buildings, all that sort of stuff. But the trick to working cooperatively, for example, Norway has a nice trick. If you want to drill for oil in Norway, the government will take an equity stake. What that means is that even if you were trying to give a shady deal to benefit the company, the oil company, or even if they dodged their taxes, you'd get it back anyway because you own a big equity stake. So it really forces your interests to align. So in Australia, when the petroleum sector dodges the petroleum resource rent tax, we can't even see their books. We have to ask nicely, jump through the hoops to get the tax office the power to see their accounts. In Norway, they're on the board. They just go, oh, yeah, okay, so we didn't pay any tax. That's right. How much is our dividend this year? Okay, well, that's 2/3 of what you dodged in tax anyway. So there are tricks like that in those big important sectors that you can do. I'm a bit wary of public-private partnerships, for example, in hospitals and schools and things like that, simply because there's no real gain and there's no real budgetary gain either. You just end up paying an annual rent or a fee to the private sector instead of borrowing the money at a super cheap rate and paying it. If you had a state bank, you could pay it to your own state bank.
Yeah.
I don't see a huge gain, but there are obviously areas where you might want to do it where the public's never done it before and they might want to get involved in supporting new export-focused industries. And in those situations, what you want to do is make sure that there are time limits. You don't give people perpetual or very long-term rights to things. They have to then bid again to work out what the market price is in another 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
So you only get the right to own and manage this PPP project for 10 years. Then you have to bid against other people who might want to pay us higher price to manage it for the 10 years after that and get the income. So you're always extracting the full market value and not just giving it away. And in that 30 or 50-year period that a lot of the road projects are on the books for, or even 60 years, you're not just giving a massive opportunity for them in those early years to manipulate the system and then reap all those rewards for another 40 years. You're actually going to get the market value back every time, even if they get advantages, even if there's political favors done. In a few years' time, when you auction off the right to manage it for another 10 years, well, because you've given the favor, it's worth more, so you get the value back.
Yeah. So you could say in democracies, in our democracies, that you get the parliament going off, they have their debates, but there's never really much in the way of public scrutiny and really the public having a go. Can you highlight to us, like, is it part of the media's problem? Is it part of the public not being that interested? So, like, why do they want to get themselves involved in this kind of stuff? Is it because the politicians make it so complicated?
Yep.
How do you view it?
A little bit of all of that, actually. In many ways, you can tell if a law is designed to give favors because it's complicated. So the tax law, I think, is thousands of pages. Other laws are much shorter and punchier, and so it's designed to have loopholes for starters. It's designed to be difficult to interpret, and I think in the book we make a point of saying that the more complicated the regulation, the better, because then fewer people can understand what it means. It's easier for the insiders to manipulate it to their advantage, or play off, the requirement in Section 53 versus the clause in Section 77. They can argue whichever suits them, I guess, when it's a complicated piece of legislation. So there's a bit of that. And I certainly think, there's not a huge advantage from trying to get everybody involved. What you need to do is get representative groups of people who are going to lose out involved. And, it's very hard to set up the institutions that a government could set up to communicate this to people, but certainly some sort of outreach would be a valuable addition in the lawmaking process to explain how this would happen.
Yeah.
Of course, once you set that up, the politicians will then just make a really confusing law to then get through this system and disseminate it in a confusing way, and then just change it, and then no one's going to bother keeping up. So in a way, it's a bit like transparency. You can tell everyone everything, but at the end of the day, no one really wants to follow politics. They just want them to get on with the job. And, it's a luxury in some ways that they do mostly get on with the job and no one does have to follow politics. So when everyone starts getting upset about it, then they've been stepping on too many toes.
Yeah. Oh, and that's why there's good people like you in society who go, oh, actually, I'll try and focus my energy and resources onto this problem. And really, that there isn't any support structure for you to do this. It's not like there's a government agency there for you to start working in and really going at it, because, well, they've pretty much been co-opted. So it really is up to the individual to sort of make and act.
That's right. And I think you will find through philanthropy, through new political parties, people will organise and form, reasonable scale organisations that have good people that have some solutions that they can put forward. There are certainly think tanks that say a lot of what I've said in the book, and they have lots of, people funding them and supporting them to participate, even though the most well-funded think tanks obviously are from the players in the game.
Yeah.
The same weapons can be used by society at large if we pull our finger out and get organised. So yeah, there's no formal networks, but I think we're a rich country, and there are plenty of good people out there who will organise and put their money and time into it. So I expect you'll see more of that in the coming years as the chaos and craziness of Australian politics gets much worse than you ever thought it could get.
Yeah. So one of the things that comes out a lot during election times, I think the people say this a little bit more than the actual politicians, is that, and you've mentioned about the complexities of the tax system, why not just have a flat tax? It seems like it's so unfair anyway. You're probably better off just doing a flat tax system, and at least everyone's putting in their fair share.
Do you mean on income, household income?
Yeah, income tax.
Yeah. Well, two things. Not everyone thinks that a rich person paying 10% of their income and a poor person paying 10% of their income is fair. That's a type of fairness, but I think most people think the wealthier you are, the more you should pay as a share, and that's the logic behind the Buffett rule, to make sure that the wealthier you are, that you don't pay a lower share of your income than poorer people.
Yeah.
But my as a general rule, though, I think taxes on labour income and wage income should be radically reduced. And I think that's, as I said, the average house in New South Wales made more than the average worker in New South Wales last year and paid half the tax. The problem we have right now in terms of wage earners is that to employ someone, we get this massive tax wedge, the cost of employing them and what they get in their pocket at the end of the day. And And the incentives are very, very bad. And every economist knows this. Everyone, every tax review, it's like tax economic rents, tax the stuff we give away for free, tax the value gains in your land, tax the natural resources, reduce the taxes on labor income, reduce the effective marginal tax rate. So what that is the net loss of every extra dollar in income you get, because not only are you taxed, but you lose benefits at the same time. And that's a big one for families with children, because there are multiple benefits: childcare benefits, family tax benefits.
Yeah.
There are many families who can earn $20,000 more in market income in a year and have $0 extra in their bank account, because everything they've earned has gone either to tax or a reduction, a phasing out of their benefits. So I'm personally in a similar situation like that. I think I'm an economist with 3 degrees in economics, a PhD,
Yeah.
and I've worked out that our effective marginal tax rate is something like 75 or 80%.
Yeah.
So if I take on an extra consulting contract for $1,000, I get $250 for it.
Yeah.
So I've got to consider that. And so, I'm lucky enough that I don't have to work as much as some people to earn my money, and I get the chance to work a little bit less and take those gains as leisure and as my research time and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But I totally understand the frustration and the fact that we have this $100 billion a year giveaway in our resources, in our banking sector, in our property sector, and all those things, while at the same time, your average wage earner is getting taxed to the blue moon. What their employer pays and what they get is a huge gap between compulsory super, which they never see, and a tax on labour that they never see, and then the dynamic effects of this phasing out of our social welfare system. In terms of the flat tax, I don't think perfectly flat is the answer, but do you know what? Something radically different that radically shrinks the share of federal income tax revenue, fair share of federal tax revenue from wage income. I mean, we didn't even have a tax on wage income until we needed a tax, I think, to raise the army for the First World War. So it's possible to have a society and tax other things. I think we should be, as a ballpark figure, halving the amount of tax that we get from wages and taxing other things like capital gains, like land value gains and all that sort of stuff.
Now, we've been talking about this a lot recently, and it's happening everywhere around, well, in the West anyway, is that we're seeing this wave of nationalism, protectionism. Do you see this as a way of people getting out of this mess? Now, like, another example here of the tax system is that we could have a high import tax. So we'll start taxing anybody that's buying all of these luxury items, these iPhones, all this kind of stuff, really pushing Australia to make its own goods for its people and bringing back car industries, things like that. Is this nationalism thing, would you say, is a good thing, or do you think necessarily there's too many undertones which are too negative that are going to potentially spiral out of control?
I think on balance, it's actually good. On balance of all the issues involved, I think it's closely related to the elite networks in any particular country scraping off too much of the growth of the last 30 years or even 40 years. And the end result being that China protected its national interests and it grew really fast and got its people out of poverty. You didn't protect our national interests, and we can't even make a car engine anymore.
Yeah.
So I actually pose these sorts of questions to my macroeconomics class at university. I say, well, fundamentally, all of these economic questions are moral questions at the end of the day. They're moral judgments. Should we use the exchange rate to dampen the effect of external demand for Australian currency?
Yeah.
Should we basically make the conscious decision that the tourism industry should suffer so that we can have a mining boom? Should we make the conscious decision to have free capital movement and with our trading partners when they have massive restrictions on free capital movement in the opposite direction? Should we let our car industry compete on its merits, on its financial and market merits, against international companies that are supported by public institutions? I mean, at the end of the day, these are all moral judgments. I don't think the economic cost of supporting domestic manufacturing is very high at all. And in fact, we had a system called Bretton Woods for a long time, and the basic idea of that was to protect national interests and not let things get out of balance. So if you did have a trade surplus for a large trade surplus, they would rejig your exchange rate so that it would be more expensive to buy your exports and give everyone else a chance.
Yeah.
Essentially, it was a trade targeting regime to make sure things didn't get out of balance, and it worked very well, and there was a massive amount of growth. So with that sort of cooperation, we can do that again. Of course, it would probably be a lot harder for Korea and now China and probably for India in the future to grow out of poverty with their export-led growth than it has been. So perhaps on the whole, globally, it's been good to let them have this export-led growth and grow out of poverty. But then we have these massive imbalances in Europe. So I think on the whole, the political shift to national protectionism is a political shift to just looking after people's own society. It's responding democratically to what people want to do. They want to be able to make things for themselves. They don't want to have to rely on sell dirt to China and buy everything else back from Asia, from Japan, China, or from the US.
Yeah.
They want to be able to make things themselves. Maybe we should keep that iron ore in the ground and start making things with it and selling that. And I think Australia's been very sucked in, compared to other countries internationally, into this free capital movement, let the exchange rate do the work business. And yeah, we've really seen a narrowing of our economic base in terms of diversity. Our exports now are almost 100% primary industries. I mean, they always have been in some ways, but just pure iron ore and coal is now something like 55 or 60% of our exports.
Yeah. I always like this quote is that the most important resource in Australia is not what's in the ground, but what's in our skulls.
Yeah, and we know it's a risk to be a resource exporter and rely on that and let the exchange rate go up. We know it is. We've seen the Dutch do it. We've seen the Norwegians put in a huge amount of effort to battle off the vested interests of the British and American oil companies to reclaim that and protect it. We've seen the Swiss protect their exchange rate and their manufacturing industry during the crisis. And we can see in Australia the stability now of the industry, that the Aussie dollar is back at 74 cents instead of over $1 US. We can actually see that this has an effect. Yet, someone made a moral judgment, no, not so much consciously, but through the institutions and the relationships, we all sort of decided informally that we're just going to crush manufacturing for a few years and we're going to crush tourism while we build these mines. And perhaps maybe we shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should have just kept some in the ground. And now we have this crazy gas crisis. So, I mean, it's easy in retrospect for me to say this. Yeah, certainly the mining industry has been looked after quite well compared to a lot of others. And I think people do care about doing something different and buying Australian made and seeing that when they're part of a system that supports their fellow Australian and not just part of a global system, feeling like they're always helping the Chinese grow and never Australia, and they're going backwards.
Yeah.
It's totally understandable to me.
Do you see that this movement? Do you think it's going to be adopted by the right wing, the nationalist movement? You go so far as to say potentially fascism, where people are working. There's a uniting and using the industries and all the sectors to work for the national interest. There's this social Darwinism thing to say that our culture is the best. Is it going to be the other side? Is it going to be the left to say that there should be equality throughout society? However, that sometimes gets co-opted and you get another kind of leader which is fairly similar to the fascist.
Yeah.
Or do you think it's going to be more of a decentralizing kind of thing where we're trying to say, okay, less government seems to do too many things wrong, let's just try and work out a way that we can decentralize the power to make our own choices rather than the government making ours?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in general a fan of decentralizing power so that all those incremental, decisions aren't so big and valuable and easily corruptible. But of course, once you decentralize it and then let some sort of system grow from a local area, then you've got a new version of central power. So it's there's a guy who does podcasts. His name, the Library of Econ Talk, Ross Roberts, and he's always like, I like bottom up institutions, not top down. I'm like, well, aren't the top-down ones just the day after you've set up the bottom-up ones, and then you have to enforce them? Um, so, yeah, decentralization as a rule is okay. Where do I see it going? I mean, at the heart of it, the idea of a nation state is not going away. We're not going to become a global community and all cooperate and bring everyone out of poverty. The nation state is it's a real thing that people believe. Everyone believes it, therefore it's a real thing. You can see that with Brexit. Europe was not a real thing that they were part of. The UK was. So I think nationalism will come around. I mean, my hope is that it can be hijacked by people with common sense who can do basic things and look for cooperative agreements and just support the economic growth and the capturing of the economic rents and just doing some of the basic things that I talk about in the book of they're politically difficult, but look, if you're in this period of upheaval, that's when the political opportunity has risen, when that electoral power is so strong that you can face up to some of those interests.
Yeah.
So I guess that's my hope, but I think it could really go anyway at these kind of crisis points.
Yeah. Say in Australia you get these massive primary industries with who are very monopolistic as well. Do you see that these industries should be working in the public interest because they're just so big, or do you think there's ways to foster more competition, like you have in the tech sector, perhaps?
Yeah, I don't see competition playing much of a role in the minerals and oil and gas sector. They're definitely individually and jointly going for automation where they can in terms of self-driving trains and running their facilities, and that's all fine. But at the end of the day, the basic equation of that is the community owns the minerals, they get it out, and we've essentially given them ownership for a period of time to get it out. What we just really need to do is get the market price for the community and let them make a small profit on their operation acting it, which is essentially the Norwegian system. And a lot of other countries, even Papua New Guinea and Timor, are trying to implement similar systems. They're very, very difficult when you don't have a strong and powerful public service and bright people who know how to negotiate and deal and dig to the bottom of these accounts. But I think that's the best thing. I mean, the alternative proposed in the book sometimes, the alternative is, well, you create a public competitor. I don't want to nationalize a whole industry, but what I want to do is make sure that there's some kind of competition. I don't want them to act like a cartel. So, for example, in banking, the obvious thing is to create a public bank that does low risk lending and day-to-day retail accounts for basically at cost. And if the private banks think they can do something more spectacular than that, high risk lending, other sorts of trading, lots of fancy additions, sell insurance, sell packages, do branch banking, business banking that offer these great facilities, and they can do that and they can charge a price for it. But if they can't get the basics, if they want to rip off people for doing the basic public function of being a bank and managing the money of society and creating the loans for society, they're going to have to do at least as well as a bunch of bureaucrats and incompetent administrators in a public bank. And if they can do better than that, then they'll make some money. And if they don't, then they won't. So that's sort of my other rule of thumb is in these sorts of sectors that are big and important. We can do it. We've had many public organisations like this before.
Yeah. All this talk does make people feel rather helpless. And say if I said, right, I've had enough of this, I walk down to my local MP and say that all this corruption is going on, I'd take notes of all the bits that you cite in your book. What's going to happen? I'm just going to get laughed at.
It depends on the MP. I've actually met many, and they're very supportive, but they're very aware of reality and the political game that goes on and the risks that they would take.
So they'll just say, oh, well, the game's going on, and yeah, we know.
No, yeah. Yeah, no, not really. More like if I was in the inside, I'd have the power to change things, but I wouldn't want to because I'd be on the inside. The point is you have to build up allies that have the same objective. You have to get those think tanks and those wealthy people and those alternative political parties and build up this hard to ignore alternative that then can have an effect on the electorate, that can participate in those debates and all those incremental changes that are gifts here and there. Make it hard to ignore. when the electoral timing's right, then you can strike and get the change. Just telling one MP that a councillor is corrupt is no news to anyone. I did my research on the political networks and rezoning decisions, and a lot of people in the industry said, "Yeah, what are you trying to tell me? What's new?" This is the nature of the industry, I was told. And I said, "Yeah, but you do realize how much money you're giving to these people?" And they're like, "Yeah, that's the nature of the industry. Don't you know that?" I'm like, "Yeah, I do. I just did the research. I want to change it. I want you to be angry about it. I want you to change it." Very hard to get that sort of passion from people who already make a good living in a secure job, who rely on the insiders for their income.
Because obviously there's this like deterministic, or I don't know, just like this, oh, fuck the system kind of attitude where it just says, look, this thing is going to have to take a massive reset to expose the players and like bring us to this end game so we can start from scratch again, so we can level the playing field. So I feel like I've got a bit more of an opportunity in life than the system that's running against me right now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you sympathise with that view? Do you see that's a credible view, or do you think, oh, well, no, there's still a fight to go on now?
You're saying the view is we got to kind of dismantle everything, put everyone in jail, and
Well,
start
just
again.
not necessarily my view, but just like somebody who sits back and watches it.
Yeah, I understand the rationale. In fact, there's a great book, if you haven't read it, called The Dictator's Handbook.
Right.
And there's actually a great YouTube video summarizing the main ideas. And essentially it says, if you want to make radical changes, you have to dismantle all these vested interests and cut them off at the head, put them in prison, put people in charge that you want, and really dismantle the previous system if you want to make change. And in some ways, yeah, that's true. I think Australia's in a bit of a privileged position where we can, when the timing's right, do some pretty radical things. The superannuation system, Medicare, we got the NBN up, sort of almost there. At least something's being done. We can do it when the opportunity is right. I think if there's a little bit more political pressure, we could get a few things done in one election cycle. But I think you've got to do it smartly. You've got to form your own networks and put them in power, and put the effort into dismantling the established networks that are going to kind of block you off at every turn.
Yeah. So one of the things that I see, this is one of the more of a credible thing that I can see happening in the future, and it sort of plays into that kind of person's perspective of like this end game, but it's slightly different. It's not a case of the thing being changed by us going to the power centers and changing it from within, but from an external side. There's these external disruptors which are happening, like, so for example, Uber, and they're coming in, they're breaking down the taxi licensing, almost like a state official licensing. You get in Bitcoin coming in, and they're proposing a different version to fiat money. You're seeing these breakthroughs which are happening of really giving an alternative position of monopolies. Now, do you see that this is it just unfolding now, or and do you think it's going to it's going to become a bigger thing, or do you just see these as like little tiny things that are happening and either maybe just irrelevant?
So far, relatively small. I don't think that sort of stuff is going to disrupt things like mining, large scale sort of infrastructure intensive industries. In terms of things more like education, payment systems, taking away from the credit card companies, stuff like that, yeah, there's certainly a role. I think a lot of people think that Uber's disruptive effort was technology, and I think that's a big mistake. The taxis companies in Australia had apps for ordering taxis before Uber. Their disruptive power, and along with Airbnb, was to essentially have deep enough pockets to break the rules for long enough to get them to be changed.
Right.
That is what their power is. Airbnb is essentially all implicitly illegal. We're not 100% sure, based on local, residential zoning requirements with short-term leases. it's basically happy to operate illegally, and they were in Uber as well. And so the power then was it was essentially a protest, almost a powerful protest, showing an alternative that went on for long enough, that paid the fines. That's what gave them the disruption. It wasn't the fact that it was a technology or an app. Anybody could have done short-term leasing on a real estate website, any real estate website, and not Airbnb. There's nothing particularly innovative about Airbnb. I've been booking holiday houses online for a long time on real estate agents' websites, right? So it's not the technology that's different, it's the willingness of them to build their allies of drivers and to be willing to break the rules for long enough to change them. And so I definitely see value in there being external disruptors, because you have to break down the power and build up enough support for change to get it. So in that way, they're good, but don't think that they're a long-term solution, because Uber doesn't want to tell the tax office who its drivers are and what they're paying. And a lot of their advantage anyway comes from the fact that their drivers can avoid declaring a lot of their income. So, for example, the ACT said, yeah, we'll legalise Uber and we'll change our taxi laws. We think this is good modernisation. The ACT is got a lot of smart politicians and bureaucrats there. But then they said, but on the condition that you tell us who's you're driving and how much money they earn, so that we could administer the tax, and provided that you pay your corporate tax as well. And of course they said, no, thanks very much, but no. We'll take your rules, but not give you, but not contribute back. So don't think that these are, good global citizens, or that they're any different from anyone else who wants to play the game. Okay, sure, you can break down the taxi industry and you might end up with a massive Uber industry and no one paying tax on it.
Yeah.
So maybe you were better with the taxi industry, at least paying tax, but having higher taxi fees. So the disruption, things need to be disrupted, and this happens. And I talk about it in the book, but just be aware that that's not the end. It's not the end. Then you have to set up robust systems that ensure that they don't become the next mate in this game.
Yeah. I agree where you're coming from there. So you could say that if everyone's in it for themselves, wouldn't the system be better to arrange things to say that corruption happens there, therefore apply non-trusted party methods? Now, one of the things about blockchain technology is that it is possible where you say that these government contracts for building roads and all that kind of stuff, that could be done by having a transparent system like an auction. You could have incorruptible bid contracts where private people, there's literally, we talked about the private sector and the public sector, they don't even have to get involved with each other at all. It's distributed on ledgers, so every member of the public can see the government's ledger. So you've got a view there as well. So do you see this kind of thing playing out as a decentralizing form of governance where power is going back to the hands of the people?
I don't see the net effect being that. I mean, at the end of the day, the power is forcing you to use that Bitcoin technology and not someone else's technology, right? Whatever one it is. The power is forcing you to use the system, whatever the system is. The debate about the blockchain currencies and stuff I find quite interesting. I said, well, which one should you use?
Yeah.
Because it's the power to tell you which one to use that is the power of the monetary system. That's what the trust is in money. I also find that, in fact, a lot of the time, this sort of irreversible and anonymous transactions are exactly the opposite of what you want. If you look at PayPal as the alternative, why people like using PayPal is that it's got insurance, and you can reverse the transaction if you don't get your thing delivered.
Yeah.
Okay, there's more to the transaction than just being paid quickly and cheaply and something going to your account. There's a whole consumer law built around the trust needed for a transaction,
Yeah.
and what it implies and who gets it and how. So I don't. I mean, I do see this sort of technology ending up being a tool in a lot of places, but I don't see it radically changing the structure and changing the nature of corruption between people. I mean, technology's changed for 2,000 years, and yet we're talking about the same type of corruption that the ancients had. Um, we'll be using different tools, and we'll try different tools to make avoiding corruption cheaper and more efficient. But I think the fundamental problem is just a human one, and we need to think about institutions we can all agree with that are going to last a decent period of time, that take away the value gains from being corrupt.
Thank you very much for that, Cameron Murray. How can people find more about the work that you're doing?
The best place to read what I'm on about is at my website, fresheconomicthinking.com. If you want to see what the book itself is about, I've got a series of video pods and promo pods that summarize some of the main points in the book, and that's at gameofmates.com. And you can see where you can buy the book at gameofmates.com. And if you do buy the book, please leave a review on the web where you've bought it.
Yep. Sorry, I haven't done mine yet. And have you got any other future projects on the horizon?
I think I might take a tilt at politics. I think in terms of this rising outsider group needing to coordinate, I think I'm going to play a role there.
Right.
In terms of academic research, I have quite a few things that are far down the pipeline, but not much new coming along.
Yeah.
I need to start making a living for my family, and I think I've burnt a lot of bridges by pointing the finger at all this grey corruption.
Yeah.
So there are plenty of people who won't want to hire me as an economist.
Yeah.
But I think there are a growing group of outsiders who really want to have their say and put workable solutions out there, who are being bamboozled by insiders. And so I'm going to try and build my networks there and see what I can do.
All right, Cameron, we'll keep on stabbing at it. Good luck to you. And yeah, we'll be in touch. And any further developments, I'll love to have you back on the show.
Yeah, great to talk tonight, Charles.
Thank you.